Not too long ago, something truly unsettling happened to me. It was just a few weeks back when I came home from work, like any other day. I live alone in an apartment where I've been for about 2 years. It's a decent place, nothing fancy, but quiet enough. About 10 or 20 minutes after I got home, around 4 p.m., I heard a knock at my front door. When I opened it, I saw a woman standing there, someone I didn't recognize. She told me she had just seen a man trying to break into my car. According to her, she had watched me park and walk away, and minutes later, a man approached my car, testing the doors and windows. Concerned, I stepped outside with her to check. My car was parked in the lot right outside the building, in my usual spot among many others. When we got there, everything looked fine. The doors were locked, the windows intact. I didn't see the man she had described anywhere. After thanking her, I went back inside, shaken but relieved. Things took a turn for the worse the next morning. As I left for work, I noticed a car running a short distance away, positioned near the back of the parking lot. I didn't think much of it until I drove past and happened to glance over. Sitting behind the wheel was the same woman from the day before. I assumed she lived in the building, though I had never seen her before. It was a large complex after all. I didn't see her again that day. But the following evening, just as I parked my car, another vehicle pulled into the lot. It stopped at the back, right where I had seen her before. I turned my head, and there she was, sitting in the driver's seat, watching me. Something felt off. Instead of getting out of my car immediately, I waited to see what she would do. To my unease, she did the same. For 10 whole minutes, we both sat there. She never moved. Finally, tired of the standoff, I stepped out and walked into my building. She remained in her car the entire time. By now, I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something truly strange was going on. I tried to brush it off, until 2 nights later. That night, I stayed up much later than usual, probably around 1 or 2 a.m., just watching movies in my living room. Out of nowhere, I heard the sound of my doorknob rattling. My heart nearly stopped. I turned my head and saw the knob twisting as if someone was trying to open the door. Thankfully, it was locked. I froze, expecting a knock or some explanation. But nothing came. Slowly, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. It was her. She stood there, staring at my door, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I debated confronting her, but something held me back. Instead, I just watched. After about 30 seconds, she simply turned and walked away. That was the last time I saw her. Since that night, she hasn't returned. I've checked the parking lot multiple times, and her car is gone. I even asked a few neighbors if they had ever seen her, or if she lived in the building. No one knew her. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, and honestly, I hope I never find out. I'm a female, and this happened one summer when I was home from college. During the break, I was living at my parents' house and working at a nearby retail store. One day, I received a message on Instagram from a man I didn't recognize. He was much older than me, and I had no idea who he was. His message was just a simple, "Hi," but I didn't respond. Over the years, I've had random guys message me, and I usually ignore them. Most of the time, they don't persist. However, this man was different. He sent another message, then a third when I ignored the second. Annoyed, I blocked him and assumed that was the end of it. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The next day, I received a friend request from the same man on Facebook. I declined it, but I didn't block him right away. Soon after, I noticed he had liked several of my old posts and commented on some of my pictures. His comments weren't just about the pictures. He was also asking me to accept his friend request. Unnerved, I deleted his comments and blocked him on Facebook as well. I didn't know who he was, and honestly, I didn't care. He was being a creep and had no reason to keep contacting me when I clearly wasn't interested. Things were fine for a few days, until he showed up at my job. The first time I saw him in the store, I didn't recognize him at first. I had only seen his profile picture before blocking him, and I hadn't paid much attention to his appearance. I was working as a cashier when he approached me, with no items. Right away, I knew something was wrong. He greeted me and brought up Facebook and Instagram, asking why I kept blocking him. He claimed to be a nice guy and wanted to know what my problem was. That's when it hit me who he was. I was beyond creeped out, especially because I never thought he even lived in my state. I assumed he was just some random internet stalker from across the country. The realization that he was actually nearby was terrifying. He started asking when I got off work, but I refused to answer. Instead, I told him I wasn't interested and that he needed to leave. At first, he acted defensive and questioned my reaction, but eventually, he walked away. A few days later, he showed up at my job again. This time, he didn't approach me. He just walked around the store, pretending to shop while sneaking glances at me. He stayed for about 30 minutes before leaving without purchasing anything. That's when I told my boss, who assured me to let him know if the man returned. Thankfully, I didn't see him at work again. But just a few days later, I got home from my shift around 8 p.m. My parents were out, so I was home alone. An hour later, at around 9 p.m., I heard a knock at the front door. Cautiously, I left my bedroom and peeked through the living room window. My stomach dropped. It was the same man. This was beyond disturbing. How did he know where I lived? I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them I had a stalker who had now shown up at my house. Then, I locked myself in my bedroom and stayed on the line with the 911 operator, heart pounding. For the next 10 minutes, I sat frozen in fear as I waited for the police to arrive. Thankfully, the man didn't try to break in. When the officers arrived, they found him in my backyard, trying to find a way inside. He was arrested on the spot. I explained the entire situation to the police, from the social media messages to his appearances at my job and now my home. I was relieved he was caught, and since then, I haven't seen him again. He's still legally required to stay a good distance away from me, and I hope I never encounter him again. When I lived in the city, I would walk to and from work every day. It was about a 15-minute walk, and while I disliked it when the weather was cold, it wasn't too bad most days. I always took the same route, sidewalks along busy city streets, to reach my job. One night, I got off work late. Normally, the sidewalks would have at least a few people around, but at this hour, it was quiet. As I walked, I suddenly glanced behind me for no particular reason, and that's when I saw him. A man, dressed in all black, walking far behind me. His hood was up, hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly downward. He was too far away for me to make out any details, but something about him just felt off. I continued walking, keeping an ear out. 5 minutes later, I turned a corner and heard footsteps behind me. When I glanced back again, he was still there, closer this time. As I turned 2 more times in a span of 2 blocks, he followed every turn. Now, I was certain he was following me. My heart pounded as I picked up my pace. I didn't want to lead him straight to my building, so I took a sharp turn down an alleyway, running to another street. When I finally made it home, I didn't see him again. A week later, I left work late again, and once more, I spotted the same man. He followed me in the exact same way as before, staying just far enough back. Once again, I lost him by running through an alley. That night, when I got home, my phone rang. The number was unknown. Curious and slightly nervous, I answered. But there was no voice, just breathing on the other end. I asked, "Who is this?" No response, just more breathing. Then, the call disconnected. I was completely unnerved, but I tried to convince myself it was just a prank. However, a few nights later, it happened again. Another late-night call, another round of breathing. I blocked the number immediately. I have no doubt that the caller and the man who followed me were the same person. It was too much of a coincidence. I never saw him again after that, though. A month later, I moved to another city for work. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I was relieved to leave that place behind. I work a pretty typical office job in the city and live about 15 minutes away. I take the same route every day, navigating through the usual traffic near the city. But once I approach my neighborhood, the roads are much quieter. I mention this Because one evening, I noticed a car following me home. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as I got closer to my neighborhood, the traffic thinned out, and the same car kept making every turn I did. When I pulled onto my street, I realized I didn't recognize the vehicle. It didn't belong to any of my neighbors. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a blonde woman wearing sunglasses behind the wheel. She slowed down as she passed my house, but didn't stop. The next day, I was more alert on my drive home. Sure enough, the same car appeared in my mirror. This time, I was certain she was following me. Instead of going straight home, I decided to drive around the block once. She mimicked every turn. My suspicion was confirmed. I finally pulled into my driveway, and like before, she simply drove past. That night, I kept checking out my window, half expecting her to show up again. But there was nothing. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was all a coincidence. But the next night, she was there again. Frustrated, I decided to put an end to this. Just before reaching my neighborhood, I pulled over to the side of the road. At first, she started to pull over too, but then she abruptly swerved back onto the road and sped away. I felt relieved. Maybe I had scared her off. I was wrong. The following evening, she was back. This time, I decided to repeat my tactic. I pulled over, expecting her to drive off again. But instead, she pulled over completely and came to a stop. My heart pounded as we both sat there in silence. Then, 2 rear doors of her car opened, and 2 large men stepped out. They were big. They didn't look friendly. And I knew immediately that something was very, very wrong. A surge of panic hit me, and I dove back into my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. Just as I peeled away, I saw the men running back to their vehicle. Within seconds, they were following me again. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, giving my location and describing the car. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. Before the police could arrive, the woman abruptly turned down another street and disappeared. I was left alone, shaken and breathless. When the officers showed up, I told them everything. But with no license plate number and only a vague description, there wasn't much they could do. The next morning was a Saturday. I didn't have work, so I decided to take my dog for a walk around the neighborhood. I was just a couple of blocks from my house, near a small park, when I saw them. 2 men walking down the sidewalk toward me. Even from a distance, I recognized them as the ones from the woman's car. My stomach dropped. Without hesitation, I turned around and sprinted back home, my dog bounding beside me. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, locking every door behind me. That was the last time I saw them. The woman never followed me again. The men never showed up near my house after that day. To this day, I have no idea who they were or what they wanted, and I never want to find out. I now live in a smaller house in a busy neighborhood. It's quiet and safe, or at least I thought it was. One afternoon, I was outside gardening when I noticed a man walking down the street. I didn't recognize him, but I didn't think much of it. 10 minutes later, he walked by again. Then, another 10 minutes after that, he passed by once more. This time, we made eye contact before he quickly looked away. His aimless wandering struck me as strange, but he eventually disappeared, and I forgot about him. A few days later, I was gardening again. That's when I saw him once more. But this time, he stopped. He just stood there, watching me. Unnerved, I walked toward the edge of my yard, and he suddenly approached. "Hi," he said. "I'm your neighbor." I forced a polite smile. "Hi." Without saying anything else, he just turned and walked away. Strange. But I figured maybe he was just awkward. Over the next few days, I didn't see him until one terrifying night. I was asleep when a noise woke me. A scratching sound coming from the back window. Still groggy, I got up and stepped into my bedroom doorway. That's when I heard the glass breaking. My stomach dropped. Someone was breaking in. Heart racing, I locked my bedroom door and grabbed my phone, whispering to the 911 operator that someone was in my house. I heard footsteps moving through my home. Then, they stopped outside my bedroom door. The handle twisted, locked, the footsteps retreated. For a moment I thought they had given up, but then they returned. Whoever it was hovered outside my room, listening. Suddenly I heard cars approaching outside, police. The intruder must have heard them too, because the next sound I heard was footsteps retreating quickly. The police caught him as he tried to leave. It was the man from the street. Turns out, he wasn't my neighbor at all. He lived in the next city over. When the police searched his house, they found photos of me. Some taken from my social media, but others had been taken of me outside, without me knowing. I had been watched, stalked. To this day, I still shudder to think about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. I'm just grateful he was caught before he could do anything worse.